Before I introduce myself, though, maybe we can begin by thinking about if you were to paint a picture of Quaker worship, what would that look like? Or if you, as you conjure up an image of friends at worship, what does that look like in your mind? If you've been around us for a long while, or you have a deep love for our history, something like this might emerge. That old picture of the presence in the midst, of people being gathered into the experience of the living Christ and to join in a sense of reverence. Maybe your mind goes to a more modern day image of friends gathered in a circle and settled into the silence and listening deeply individually and hopefully listening together to how Spirit it may be speaking. And generally that gathering lasts about an hour, as we know, and sometimes it's interspersed with a message. But of course, it doesn't look like that in all places in the world. In Kenya, for instance, there are hundreds and hundreds of meetings that gather people from 50 up to probably 1,500 friends. And there'll be loud singing and dancing and choirs and great music. And worship will often last several hours. And the preacher's message, and I've given many there, sometimes will go for 45 minutes or an hour. Sometimes in a place like this, in Kitale, which is in the north, kind of north central Kenya, this is a group of young friends who showed up about 7:30 in the morning before worship to sing. And so that sense that this is a day set aside for being worship together is really, really important to many friends there. And again, the singing is pretty amazing to settle into. Another one that I'll show you comes from a place in the northern part of Kenya called Samburu. And the dancing and the dress and so many parts of the worship is really vibrant and alive and a crucial part of their sense of being a community together. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I do want to introduce myself a little bit. My name's Colin Saxton, as Agnes said, and I'm a friend from Newberg, Oregon. My membership is with North Valley Friends here in Newberg. And I want to thank the meeting for the invitation to be with you today. I've been a Quaker since the mid-'80s, and so even though it's been a long time, I still feel like a novice in many ways. When I had an encounter with the living Christ when I was in college in 1980, and that sent me on a spiritual quest, and I went to a few different congregations, a few different denominational groups, and I was looking for something authentic and real. As I was reading the Bible and I was experimenting with prayer, I had a sense that this spiritual life that we are called into is meant to be an ongoing journey. It's something to be lived moment by moment, not a series of religious events that we attended. And that was my experience visiting so many of the congregations that I went to. And so as I sat there, and it seemed that in my experience as a Christ-centered person, that Jesus was a character that was trapped in a book, or he was an example that we were to follow, or a name that we were to revere. But I had this sense that there was this something that was meant to be this ongoing encounter, this living, risen presence that was to make a difference in our lives. So I was working with kids in prison and street kids, and I felt a call to pastoral ministry. And I started reading church history at that time, and I ran across the Quakers, and I was so intrigued by them. I thought this might be my people. And so I went to an unprogrammed meeting, and I went to a programmed meeting, one that was pastoral led. And I couldn't see that the unprogrammed meeting was going to be hiring any pastors anytime soon. So I settled into the programmed meeting. and got involved there, and they became my mother and took me in and nurtured and raised me. And I began exploring Quaker spirituality, and I was captivated by the vision of George Fox asking questions like, do you live in the life and power? Really? Or is your faith somehow just this addendum to your life? And so that's what I wanted then, nearly 40 years ago, and that's what I continue to seek these days. So over the last years, I've been a pastor. I was a yearly meeting superintendent. I taught at a Friends University and seminary. For 7 years, I was general secretary of Friends United Meeting. I currently work for Friends United Meeting again as their fundraiser, and I have some responsibilities overseeing the work we do in North America. I'm also a consultant for a Mennonite organization, helping them think about generosity and stewardship. So when I say all those things, it seems like I can't hold a job, and there's some truth to that. But the other reality that I experience more pleasantly is I've gotten to do so many more things than I ever should have been allowed to among friends, and I'm really grateful for this spiritual community. One of the greatest privileges of my life, though, has been to visit literally hundreds and hundreds of meetings in churches all around the world. I've been to, I think, 50 different yearly meetings over the last several decades. And I've loved that experience of seeing the differences, seeing the similarities. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight, is some of the things that may hold us together, some of the things that look very different across our culture. My big hope is that we can talk about it at the end after you're done listening to me. As we think about early forms of Quaker worship, I think most of us focus on the sense of silence and how Quakers gathered in the silence. But of course, our history is more complex than that. Lots of writers talk about there really being kind of three different kinds of meetings that happened among the early Friends. There were these big public meetings that were primarily evangelistic, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, not the way we've bastardized it in our culture and context here, but this sense that these early Friends had this deep experience of this great news that they wanted others to know, that the kingdom had come, that Christ has come to teach his people himself, and that they were part of this movement to restore and revive primitive Christianity. And so there was a sense of invitation that they wanted to share with other people, and they were this sense that they were these vehicles for God's day of visitation among both the church and the larger society. And so they would hold these big gatherings in markets and in fairs and at inns and public commons and open air gatherings and homes and church buildings, sometimes when they were invited, sometimes when they weren't, but people would gather from all around to hear what these Friends had to say, in part because they lived at a time of deep religious hunger and a sense of seeking something authentic. I spent several weeks in Nepal many years ago and experienced something like this there in that culture. I was traveling with leaders from the Nepalese Quaker community, and they were going from town to town, and they would hold these open air gatherings. And because it's an agrarian society, people would just stop what they're doing and come and listen. And it was fascinating to watch. And it was fascinating to be asked to speak at one of those where hundreds of folks would gather and be on rooftops and standing around the place and listen. And in that society, afterward, members of the church would get together in small groups and talk with people from the community about what they heard. And it was really interesting and intense to watch the sort of dialogue and discussion, the arguing, the questioning, this fascinating experience of seeing people wrestle around with this message of that Quakers have to offer the world. A second meeting was threshing meetings, and we often think about threshing meetings as a time where, maybe as a community, as a meeting, we'll get together to talk about something controversial without needing to make a decision about it, but just sort of have an open forum for discussion. But threshing meetings in those days had a little bit different flavor, that they were sort of the follow-up gathering to these big public meetings where folks who were interested or who had been converted, who wanted to go deeper, would come together in maybe in a large meeting hall or again outside, and they would have convinced friends who had a public ministry to come and share. And it was a forum to do this deeper threshing, to help sort out seekers from those who really weren't interested, and this inward sense of threshing, of helping people come sort of into the light, to see what are the things in their life that maybe needed to be altered, to be changed, to use Bible language of seeing the old person let go of, so that this new person could come in and be a greater part of their experience. Threshing meetings were a place where seekers often moved to being finders, and would say now that they had a home among this community that was sometimes known as the Children of Light, or the Publishers of Truth, or the Society of Friends. And then there were established meetings, or sometimes called retired meetings, where the place of ongoing work and worship, where collections of folks within a community would gather, usually weekly, sometimes more. As they were formed, they were supposed to be guided by those grown in the power and the life and the pure discerning of truth, says William Dewsbury, one of those leaders at the time. But creating these communities where this faith was embodied, and there was a sense of nurturing and caring for one another along the way. Now, silence, though, of course, was really important to early friends then and now. If you're familiar with the writings of Ben Pink Dandelion, he talks about how early Quakers had a liturgy of silence. There certainly was preaching, however, but this silence was integral to the experience. It was taken from the passage in Revelation chapter 8, where it talks about there being a half an hour of silence in heaven, where not a sound was made. That friends felt like that was a good metaphor, or an experience that should be a part of their gatherings as well. And so silence becomes the sort of root and foundation of their gatherings. But there was also lots of preaching, and sometimes these meetings would generally last about 3 hours, and there's evidence that some of these meetings would last 9 hours, which I don't know if that's ever happened at Barnegat meeting, but I don't think most friends are up to that these days. If somebody was led to speak, they would stand. Anyone could speak, men or women, which was a radical notion, as we know. Children could speak. One of my first experiences of worshiping with friends was coming to a meeting, and a young girl of about 11 years old got up and gave the most powerful message. And I thought, I want to be a part of a community where this can happen. And that was some of the experience that happened in those early days. If somebody prayed, that person would generally kneel and everybody else would stand, and they'd take off their hats, the only time that Quakers would ever take off their hats, out of reverence for God. And so there was this sort of balance between silence and this deep, rich teaching that allowed for both the formation of individuals, but also the forming of a community of people who had this sort of shared life. And I think a lot of people nowadays say that that's a healthy tension to hold. How does that get integrated? Maybe it doesn't always happen in our hour on Sunday morning, but how do we hold those tensions, those experiences of healthy, rich teaching and silence, where we allow the inward teacher to be our guide? I think the thing that they focused on was the sense that form was not maybe the biggest issue, but it's the substance. And so I've always loved the quote from one friend who talked about God being a fire and a hammer in our hearts, that worship was this place of transformation. Into the 18th century, Quakers, of course, we know, get a little bit more quiet. They're less evangelical, they're less ecstatic, they're less focused on the sort of outbreaking of the reign of God. And there's more of a sense of being inwardly focused and kind of guarded against the world, and careful about creaturely activity and our emotions and how they might lead us out of step with the Spirit. So the focus became far more on silence, and meetings were shorter, they were less vibrant. Some writers say that they've grown shorter by a half an hour every century since the beginning. And so I wonder what things are going to look like by the end of this. Maybe we'll have drive-through Quaker meetings where we just make it quick and easy. I don't know. 19th century, there's this revivalist spirit that leads to some of the splits that happen with the Quakers. Revivalism is sweeping England and the US, and these preachers are traveling about, and some folks find that meaningful, and music is found to be meaningful. Among friends, there was a large sense of growth as people were having these religious experiences and finding their ways into Quakers meetings. Some meetings felt a little overwhelmed by that and felt like they needed to release somebody to minister to these new ministers. And so we saw the innovation of the pastoralist system and a greater emphasis on the Bible, some quarters kind of moving away from the priority of the Spirit. I think in most cases back then, and I think it remains to be true today, for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with the pastoralist system, they don't think of the pastors as a priest, but rather as, or not simply as a preacher, but in the best sense, it's somebody's there who's to minister to the ministers, to help the meeting function in a healthy way, to help work around growth, spiritual growth, and discipleship, and those other kinds of concerns. And of course, this isn't an innovation that everybody could accept. And that's led to some of the disagreements and frustrations among friends. One of my first experiences of coming to a Friends World Committee gathering years ago, I was a new pastor in my yearly meeting, and I went to an FWCC gathering. I was in a worship sharing group, and a woman came up to me as the group was starting and said, "Are you a pastor?" And I said, "Yes." And I was working part-time. I was doing 2 other jobs. We had three children at the time. I made $1,000 a month, so it wasn't like I was getting rich on the job. And she said, "You're everything that's wrong with the Religious Society of Friends." And it led to a really interesting conversation with her about the role of released ministry within Quaker faith. And then she came to our meeting for worship and found that she resonated with so much of it that was there, and sensed this deep similarity and the union of spirit. And so I do think that there are things that hold us together as a religious society, despite some of our differences. One of the things that we're known for, however, is that we don't use the outward elements. Typically, there's a few Quakers that do around the world of bread and wine and water. Sometimes you'll hear, or maybe you've been asked, do Quakers do communion or baptize? And sometimes I hear Quakers say no, but I think that's a misunderstanding of our faith and practice. Early friends decided that all the bread and wine in the world wouldn't make a difference if that sense of communion wasn't authentic. And the same with the water. You could stand in the middle of an ocean and not be truly baptized, because that's a work of the Spirit. They had this sense that communion was a scripture passage that early friends often thought about when they talked about communion. Comes from Revelation chapter 3, where it's that familiar text where it says Jesus standing at the door knocking. And he said, "Anyone who opens the door and comes in, and who opens the door, I will come in and sup with them and they with me." And the friends had this sense that they had been already invited in, that they were at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so communion happened in this place of gathering together, of sharing in this wonderful feast of the Spirit, and finding it making a difference again, not only in their own lives but their life together. Francis Howgill talked about it this way: that the kingdom of heaven did gather us and catch us all as in a net. God's heavenly power at one time drew many hundreds, and we came to know a place to stand in and what to wait in, and the Lord appeared to us daily. And our hearts were knit together unto the Lord and one another in true and fervent love in the covenant of life with God. And that was a strong obligation or bond upon our spirits, which united us to one another. And we met together in the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And he goes on to talk about how these resolutions were kindled in them, and that God forms them to be this people of praise for their particular generation. And he's writing about that sense of having a gathered meeting, both the experience of it as an event when we are there together in worship, but also that ongoing effect of it, that that God is forming us as communities to continue to live into that life and power. And if you've ever experienced a gathered meeting, you know how powerful it is, how life transforming it can be. And so that was sort of the hope that they had as they thought about communion as this inward experience that was transformational to everybody. And the same, of course, for baptism, that this was about being immersed in the Spirit, this ongoing immersion into the life of God that wasn't predicated on water being present or not. Now, there is a place where I've been among Quakers where they baptize, and this was also in Nepal, and they do this regularly because when a person in that culture becomes part of in this case, a Quaker church, they're often ostracized by their family. Some of them have experienced persecution. There's even been some who've been killed for becoming part of the Quaker faith. And so they've decided that baptism is a public, there's nothing magical about it. There's nothing that, that makes it sacred in a sense, but there's this public affirmation that I'm part of this new community, and we're not doing this in hiding, we're not doing it in secret. We want people to know, not as adversaries within a community, but as just a part of a person's spiritual growth and movement. And in that particular context, it's interesting to me. It's a fascinating adaptation of our teaching, because here, for most of us in our culture, there's no cost to being a Quaker, to showing up at meeting, to identifying yourself with our religious community. There's a huge cost, and so they've decided to take that teaching about baptism and adapt it that way. And I find that a compelling argument, even though it's a bit unsettling too. Meeting houses are a part of our life together too. We don't put a lot of stock in them as against sacred places, but they're important. And often our meeting house shapes a lot about what we do. There's so many meetings in the US and in other places that are spending an inordinate amount of time and money and energy on how do we care for our meeting house. And so they look different ways. That's the one that you all do. And often there are places like your meeting that use that space for other things, for AA groups or peace and justice groups, or my meeting has housed refugees who had come from, not refugees, pardon me, from immigrants who had been released from prison, who didn't have a place to go, to be able to stay for a few days until they were being transported. So lots of creative uses for how meeting houses are used. This is the meeting across the street from where I live. It's a big Friends church that in its heyday had about 800 people, and see, it's designed very differently than most unprogrammed meetings for worship. It's got a balcony, and it's a beautiful space, and it gets used for ministry. There's obviously it's pulpit centered. They have a lot of upfront sort of things, but this is a group that spends, at least historically, used to spend a good bit of their worship time in silence as well. This is a little group in Cuba, not an uncommon picture of what Cuban meeting houses look like. Small, they're often crowded on Sunday mornings as friends gather for worship. And again, they use those spaces in a wide variety of ways throughout the week. This is what congregation that I love in the mountains of Uganda, and gathering outside for a photo afterwards, and this brick building that they fired the bricks themselves there on the property, formed them themselves to create this meeting house, and it's their place of gathering. This is a little meeting in Tanzania that I visited. The Quakers are growing rapidly actually in Tanzania, and this little meeting, that's their meeting house in the back there. On rainy days, it's not a great place to meet. They have a real passion for reaching out to the friends in their area, and they've planted 4 little sister churches. This is sort of the mother church, and they do a lot of care for people, caring for women. This church is led by a woman pastor. They have a deep concern about people's medical issues and doing really good work in their communities. This is a gives you a couple of images of meeting houses in Turkana, which is another place in the northern part of Kenya, and it's on the South Sudan border, and there's some outreach going on in South Sudan. From the very rustic meeting house to something that's a little bit more stable, that's sort of the mother church of Turkana. This is a really interesting church. I was there a few years ago. It's been I think it's almost complete now. I'm standing at the absolute top of this construction. It's called Burabura Friends. It's in Nairobi, and it will seat 2,000 people. There's a parking garage under this meeting house because they don't have any place to park for all the people who would come. When I was talking with their leadership about why did they choose to build such a big building, and they paid for it all their own. They didn't receive any international money to do this. They built it right next to the slum where their meeting house is located, and they really see it as a place of ministry. And they have all different kinds of outreaches and services that they provide there in the slum. And so it's so different. It's if Quakers have a mega church, this is probably it. Within our family of friends. This, though, is my favorite meeting house. It's maybe the one of the places where I experienced God most deeply. This is in Samburu, and this is a congregation that meets under this tree. They've met under it for probably 20 years. It's an Ewoi tree, and they love it there. They want eventually to build a meeting house, but their first priority was to build a school for their children because most of their children never had a chance to go to school. And so they didn't invest their money in a meeting house. When they got the school built, they decided they wanted to build a medical clinic for the community. And so they invested their money this way. And so this tree has continued to serve them. And I imagine will serve them well for another 10 years or so until they maybe decide they're ready to plant a building. But I was reminded when I was there that I've never done this right, that it's the people, not the steeple, that is the meeting in the church, and really grateful for that community of friends. You all probably know the story of the person coming to Quaker worship in silence and being and asking, sitting there for a long time, and finally leaning over to somebody and saying, "When does the worship begin?" When does the service begin? And the person leans over and says, when the worship is over. And I think that's a part of our sense of rhythm, that we gather for worship and scatter in order to do service. It's an important part of our understanding of what it means to be people of faith. And so you have a William Penn who says, when you come to your meetings, what do? Do you gather together bodily only and kindle a fire, encompassing yourselves with the sparks of your own kindling, and so please yourself? Or rather, do you sit down in the true silence, resting from your own will and workings, waiting upon the Lord with your minds fixed in that light, wherewith Christ has enlightened you and prepares you in your spirits and souls to make you fit for his service? So that's part of the wonder to me of worship that I experience across our many differences, our theological, our cultural, our political, our economic differences. That's one of the things that unites us, is for the most part the sense that we gather in order to be reminded and remembered as a body in order to go out to make a particular difference in the world. I want to spend just the last little bit talking about some of those kinds of service that takes place, and then we'll just open it up for conversation. I mentioned the Turkana group and the medical work in the schools they do. They're also very involved in peacemaking. There are about 3 tribes in northern Kenya that are often at war with one another, and the friends both from Samburu and Turkana have been instrumental peacemakers in helping to reduce the tension and build a greater sense of and capacity to live together in a place that's economically terribly deprived. There's a huge shortage of water. There's all different kinds of fights over land and water, and so the friends there have been instrumental in peacemaking. This is a group, one of the newest friends churches, really, that is operating in the world. It's part of Friends United meeting, a semi-programmed meeting in Belize City. It's a group that has a pastor who's from Kenya, actually, who felt called to go to Belize after reading a Quaker Life article, and was sent there by the Friends in Kenya. And he's been a community organizer and worker. He's worked with in the area of sex trafficking for a long time, and how to minimize and eliminate that. And he's the pastor of this community. And so he does a short devotion, and then they meet together and talk and share about that reflection and pray together for their community. They have a great outreach to, there's a high instance of gang involvement in the south side of Belize City. And so the meeting does a lot of work with that community. They use Alternatives to Violence program as a way of reaching out to different people. They have a wonderful feeding food program where they help communities in need, families in need. We just received a grant to start a computer lab at the center that we have where the meeting takes place, because there's an incidence of about 60% unemployment among youth in Belize City. And so training them in some marketable skill helps keep them out of gangs, helps lead to family stability, helps make a connection to a spiritual community that loves them. In Kenya, you may know that right now there's still some unsettled business about the election that took place there. And I hope you will continue to hold that situation in the light. I spoke this morning with our staff person who's responsible for Friends Church Peace Team. She's our staff, she's coordinating that work there. And they're all sort of waiting they're holding their breath to see how the election eventually turns out. But Friends Church Peace Team arose a number of years ago when there was another round of post-election violence and a whole lot of displaced people in the country. And the Friends said, wait, we have this peace testimony and we don't really do anything with it. What's God calling us to do? And so several groups were formed, including Friends Church Peace Team, to bring about healing within communities, to help people understand the importance of elections, to help monitor, to make sure that there are fair and proper elections. In this picture right here, this was after the post-election violence the last time, in a small meeting house in Mount Elgon. And one of those gentlemen actually killed the other person's spouse. And what Friends Church Peace Team was able to do was to bring them together to help them be reconciled. These were people who knew one another, who had gotten divided along tribal lines, but brought them together to bring a sense of healing, not only to their relationship, but also to the community that was continuing to be locked into the cycle of violence. And so, again, really powerful, on the ground kind of work that arose out of a sense of what's Spirit calling us to do as these friends met in worship. Another project that we sponsor is around clean water, and we create biosand filters that are sold and given away to help reduce incidence of waterborne disease throughout East Africa and other places. According to some sources, about 40 to 45% of Kenyans don't have access to clean water. And so this represents somewhere around 17 million people. And often it's in the very remote areas, and it just causes huge economic problems, as well as grief for families unless it's addressed. And so what these biosand filters do are provide an easy, affordable way for people to have access to clean waters in their homes and in their meeting houses. They're fairly inexpensive to sell. Our coordinators employ people from the church, so it creates jobs, gives them experience, and it's a great way for meetings to connect with people in their communities. There's a little congregation in a town called Kisumu, and they have a couple biosand filters sitting outside where people come from the community can come and give out can come and receive clean water. And as you might guess, this is received as a great grace and a gift to folks in the community. And so one of the questions that the pastor of that meeting asked me, who was also a woman, said, how do friends in the US offer living water in their communities? And I think that's a great question. How are we connecting with the real needs with the people around us. One of my favorite projects is the Lindy School, which is in the Kibera slum, which is a part of Nairobi. Kibera has about 500,000 people living in a square mile. There's very little running water. There's very little electricity. People live in these tiny little shacks, spaces that are about 12 by 12. It's dangerous enough that when I went to Kibera, they insisted that I have a police escort, because when people are desperate, they'll often do desperate things. And so to make sure that the people around me weren't put at risk, I had a police escort. And I kept thinking about the teachers that travel into Kibera every day to work with these kids who attend our school. The Lindy School is preschool or kindergarten through 6th grade, basically in our system. And these are kids who otherwise might not go to school. Often because they don't have the funds, their education ends at 6th grade. And so we provide scholarships as we can to support girl child education in East Africa, because many experts would say if you want to change a country, educate the girls. And so FUM has a high priority on that. This young girl I met there named Ruth, I visited her in her home, and she talked about the transforming difference a Quaker education meant for her. There's about 1,500 Quaker schools in Kenya alone. The Lindy School is just one, and they're a part of the FUM community. And it's an essential, important part of the way that Friends see their role. They're educating the next generation of people. And Ruth shared her dreams of becoming an accountant to get a job eventually, so she could get her mother and her 5 siblings out of the Lindy slum. Just 2 weeks ago, the Lindy School burned in a fire in Kibera. It was totally destroyed. So the meetings that are in the slum have worked together to create classrooms for the kids, and we're working on trying to find a way, working with Nairobi Yearly Meeting to figure out how we're going to rebuild that school. And one other is to share is just the Cuba Peace Institute. A wonderful group I love friends in Cuba, and they have a peace institute that's working on creating a culture of peace within Latin America, training leaders around Quaker peace principles, trying to deepen our understanding and practice of what it means to be peacemakers in difficult circumstances. And Cuba is certainly one of those. Ramallah Friends School as well. That's a part of FUM's work, where 1,400 Palestinian kids have a chance to go to the premier international baccalaureate school in the Middle East. And again, just a couple weeks ago, there were missiles being fired. There was a young person killed in Ramallah, and so it's a very dangerous situation. And these kids love that school, and it makes an important difference in their lives. And every time I've been there, they always say to me, thank the Quakers who support this work, because it's transforming our experience in our lives. So just finishing up, and then of course in the US, the things that we do here, the way that we try to allow service to arise out of our worship. In reality, the face of Quakerism has changed since those early days till now. When I used to go to Kenya as General Secretary of FUM, I would often invite a young woman up front and say, this is the face of Quakerism in the 21st century. And our population has continued to shrink here in North America. It continues to grow, both in East Africa and in South America. My friend Emily Province, who is an FUM board member, gave the Carey Lecture at Baltimore Yearly Meeting this last month, I think. And she said she put together some statistics that I thought was really useful that I'll just offer to you here. She says, today there are about 400,000 friends in 87 countries. I think there's a few more than that. She says probably a little more than that too. We exist in every continent except Antarctica. About 90% of us worship in pastoral, programmed meetings with songs and scripture and prepared messages, often but not always incorporating silent, expectant worship. But the other 10% of us only practice silent, expectant worship. Close to 95% of us are Christian, though that 95% would not have agreement on the definition of the word Christian, nor uniform understanding of what that means and what it looks like to follow Christ. About 5 to 6% of us would describe ourselves as non-Christian, and that 5 or 6% would not have any agreement on what label they might choose to describe themselves collectively. There are Quakers of every race and many more Quakers of color than white Quakers. A plurality, if not a majority of Friends are African, although within Africa, Friends are most likely to describe themselves using their national or tribal descriptors, not African in general. We worship in literally dozens of languages, and our cultures are so different from one another that we don't even think the same way, even when we do share a language or have the benefit of translators. The majority of Quakers are poor. A significant number of us are so poor that we are food insecure. Others of us are so wealthy, we wonder what we'll do with all of our money. Many of us live in places where there's enough violence that we have a good chance of encountering it personally. We or someone in our family is likely to either be a victim or a perpetrator of armed violence. Other Friends can't imagine living in a society with guns. Some of us travel frequently, even across national boundaries, while others will never be able to do so for political or economic reasons. So we have all these differences, and yet lots and lots of similarities. And we have this calling to continue this life, offering this message, offering this life to other people, to be a blessing, to speak to that of God in others, to use the opportunities we have arising out of our worship to make a difference in our world.